Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on medieval history. Beginning with this session, we will do a unit on Islam. It will certainly take more than one session. Muhammad, his life overlaps with some of the people we talked about earlier, and the expansion of Islam in the first century after his death also overlaps with some people we've talked about. So that's been going on in the background, so to speak. But chronologically, the next thing we would have to cover in Western history would be the Islamic invasion of Spain in the year 711, the Battle of Tours in 732, the life of St. John Damascene, a doctor of the church, because he was born in Syria after it had been conquered by Islam. And their theological issues that John Damascene dealt with, iconoclasm and the use of images, his writings were then employed at the Second Council of Nicaea in 787. And some of those issues were triggered by the encounter with Islam. So that's why we're covering it in this year. We'll do the background, the context for Muhammad's life, cover Muhammad's life, then do the first century after his death. That'll, catch us up. And then we'll do St. John Damascene and the Second Council of Nicaea. So it'll probably take a few sessions. Okay. When the future Pope, Gregory the Great, was 30 years old, and Saint Isidore of Seville, whom we've already covered, was age 10, another pivotal event occurred in history, and that is the birth of Muhammad. So our objective is not to teach Islamic theology, as I'm not qualified to do that, but rather our objective is to understand the Islamic role in medieval history. To the extent possible, we'll follow the same approach as we have with everyone we've already covered, and that is to take the people and their time period on their own terms, using their own words, to learn how they understood themselves and how they understood their world. In this endeavor, there are three essential text sources for Islam. The first is the Quran. We'll talk about that, but that is their holy book. The second is the Hadith. Those are a collection of discourses regarding the words and deeds of Muhammad and things that happened in early Islam. And the third, the Sirah. That's the biographies of Muhammad compiled by later historians. And we'll have quotes from exemplar quotes from each of these. The Quran is divided into 114, we would say chapters, but they say surahs. A surah is a portion. So 114 portions of the revelation, what they believe is a revelation. That is amounts to the book, to the Quran. They contain verses. They're arranged, the surahs, the chapters, are not arranged chronologically or thematically. They're simply arranged the longest chapter first, down to the shortest chapter last. The longest chapter has 286 verses. The shortest has only 3 verses, the last chapter. 86 of the chapters are classified as Meccan, meaning the city of Mecca, before the Hijra in 622, which we'll talk about, while 28 of the chapters are considered Medina, the city of Medina, after the Hijra. That said, since this is a course for seminarians, I mean, others are certainly welcome to listen to it, but it's a course for seminarians, so we have to set our parameters within church teaching. With regard to Islam, the view of the church is summarized in the Catechism, number 841. In it, the church acknowledges, and therefore we, members of the church, must acknowledge that Islam is monotheistic. They do believe in only the one God. And that they profess, actually the exact phrase in the Catechism, they profess to hold the faith of Abraham. So they consider themselves descendants of Abraham, who's also our father in faith. Muhammad was born in the year 570 on our calendars. Before we cover him, it's essential to place him in his historical context. As you know, the seminarians, as those who've had me know, you probably get sick of me saying it, but nothing just happens. Nothing just happens. So what did not happen is that a guy showed up and announced the new religion, and then we have over a billion people who were part of that religion. That there was a context into which Muhammad was born, and that he drew on, and that explains what happened in his life and what happened afterward. So, in particular, as far as the expansion of Islam outside of Arabia, that happened after Muhammad's death. So part of this context is the two ascendant powers in the Middle East and Central Asia at the time, the Byzantine Greeks and the Persians, that's present-day Iran. At the time, there were Zoroastrian pagans. Those two empires self-destructed. That explains the swiftness with which Islam was able to spread after Muhammad's death. Previously, we covered the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. At the time, the eastern half was not in a position to intervene for the following reasons. 2 years earlier, on the 9th of February, 474, a Federati general serving in the east became Byzantine emperor. His actual name was Tarasus. He was ethnically Isaurian from the Taurus Mountains in central Anatolia, present-day Turkey. Let's see. So he was, the Eastern Empire fell into the Federati, resorting to Federati just as the West did. But instead of, they just used different, they used people on their side of the empire. So this is present-day Turkey. I don't know if it comes out here. You see at the Black Sea here and Turkey here. So Isauria was this region here, and that's where this guy Tarasus was from. Now at the time, this whole region of Turkey was called Anatolia, and it was part of the Byzantine Empire. Meaning the eastern half of what had been the Roman Empire. So as seen in previous reigns, previous episodes, imperial dependence on Federati mercenaries to fill the army resulted in intermarriage between members of the imperial family with Federati. and this connects with the feudalism problem, as we've seen at this, a distortion of the sacrament of matrimony. That the purpose of the sacrament is not to solidify political alliances, but it was debased in this, in this way. One such marriage arrangement was between Teresus, the Isaurian Foederati, marrying Aelia Ariadne. She was a princess. She was the daughter of the Eastern Emperor Leo I. Leo is called the Thracian for obvious reasons. He was Thracian, and that really the Greeks never let him live that down. But even worse from the Greek mind is the princess marrying this Isaurian guy. In order to lessen the offense to the Greek population, Teresus changed his name to Zeno, Zeno, named for the ancient exponent of Stoic philosophy. The Emperor Leo I had no sons survive to adulthood, so when he died of dysentery on the 18th of January, 474, Zeno became the Eastern Emperor. After Leo's death, Leo had always long been resented by the Greek imperials because of his Thracian origin. But after Zeno's death, a Greek general named Basiliscus fueled this emotion to lead a revolt against Zeno that drove him out of the capital, Constantinople, for 2 years. Zeno eventually returned, prevailed over his rival, captured Basiliscus, and buried him alive, along with the rest of his family. But the civil war that it took for this to happen rendered the Byzantines unable to intervene when the Western Empire fell in 476. In ecclesiastical history, this Emperor Zeno inherited the dualism problem, dividing the Eastern Christian population. There were Nestorian Christians who denied the divinity of Christ. There were Monophysite Christians. That just means one nature. So Monophysites denied the humanity of Christ, while Orthodox Nicene Christians, Catholics, believed Jesus to be both true God and true man. And that belief, from their context, had just been reaffirmed at the Council of Chalcedon, the Fourth Ecumenical Council, in the year 451. In the year 482, the 47th bishop of the Eastern Imperial capital was named Acacius. That's Acacius. He crafted a compromise formula to deal with the dualism problem. It's called the Henoticon, which just means one image. His hope, and in this endeavor he was supported by the Emperor Zeno, was that by creating a loosely worded theological formula that leaders of all sides, of all three of these factions, could sign, then their followers would make peace. Thinking that if the wording was vague enough that all sides could agree, then it would end the rift and the church would be one again. That was the plan. In that endeavor, it failed completely because all sides realized what it was. The wording was neuter, that it pretended like there was no difference, like no explanation had to be made. If you acknowledge that Jesus existed and that God exists, then that was enough, without having to clarify all the complexities of the, one nature and person and all of that. So it utterly failed in that. But it did have one success. The Henoticon succeeded in precipitating a schism between East and West, from the papacy, that lasted for 37 years. Zeno died on April 9th, 491. He did have a son, but his son died before him. So the Empress Ariadne chose her next husband, who was going to be, essentially she chose the next emperor. She picked a civilian this time. His name was Anastasius I, as she married him. Anastasius was ethnically Greek, and as a career civil servant, he had never even served in the army, let alone was a general. The Empress Ariadne regarded these qualities as desirable. First, his ethnicity to pacify the Greek imperials, as well as to give the empire a rest after 3 generals on the throne and 3 civil wars in a 17-year period. The Emperor Anastasius was 61. The Empress Ariadne was 41. They had no children. The Emperor Anastasius I is considered the first Byzantine emperor, as his was the first peaceful transfer of power after the Western Empire fell. To the east of the Byzantine Empire was Persia, present-day Iran. Yeah, okay. So we have again the Black Sea. So you have Greece over here and Turkey. So all this at the time was part of the Byzantine Empire. Syria, Iraq, Turkey. Iraq then was Mesopotamia. So then to the east of the Byzantines is present-day Iran, and in antiquity that was Persia. So ethnically, they're different. They're not Greek. Nor are the Arabs. They are Farsi, completely different language, different culture, some of which we'll talk about shortly. So these two, the Byzantine Greeks and the Persians, that we're going to talk about those. So keep that in mind. At the time, the Persians were Zoroastrian. There were pagans who practiced pyrolatry. That's fire worship. So to the east, Anastasius had to deal with Persia. It was then ruled by the house of Sasan, the Sassanid dynasty. It was just named for a guy. A perennial source of conflict between the Byzantines and the Greeks were the border, the regions on the other side, on both sides. So we'll do to the north and the south. Okay, so between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, you'll notice that it may not come out, but there's a mountain range that we're going to talk about here, the Caucasus Mountains. It's the origin of the word Caucasian, and I'll explain that in a minute. So notice that there's north and south. The Caucasian Mountains are considered, it's like a natural border between Eastern Europe and Asia. South of the mountains, you have Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, South Ossetia, and north you have Chechnya, Dagestan, now the Russian Federation. So here you have the Greeks on Turkey, Syria, Iraq, the Holy Land, Jordan, and then you have the Persians. So this area to the north is one point of contention between the two, because whoever controls it controls more of the shoreline of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and controls the mountain passes that lead north, or correlatively could allow an enemy to come from north to south. So that's one point of contention. Now notice to the south, so you have, this is north of the Persian Byzantine bloc. Then to the south, you see down here is Saudi Arabia, I don't know if Kuwait. So from Kuwait to say Tbilisi in Georgia, that's about 1,400 miles. And so that on the northern, so this we're going to talk about the fringe in the northern part of the Persian Greek bloc and the southern part. So Arabia is the southern part, and that's going to be a point of contention. And one of the reasons I'm covering all this is because this context is going to affect Muhammad in his early life and what happened to Arabia as a result of the conflict between the Greeks and the Persians. All right, so just keep that geography in mind as we go through, because otherwise, without knowing the details, then it really does seem like, well, okay, it just happened, and that's not a correct way to study history. Okay, so the region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, the Caucasus Mountains, or just the region of Caucasia. It's named for the mountain range. The mountain range extends 835 miles between the two. On the Black Sea side, it starts at Sochi, S-O-C-H-I. Remember the Winter Olympics were held there, and then goes southeast to the Caspian Sea at Baku, B-A-K-U. Baku is where oil was first drilled commercially in 1906. That certainly changed the history of that region. It is, so today, the term Caucasian is identified with white skin. The first century Roman geographer named Pliny the Elder described the region in his work titled Natural History. He described it as characterized by snow-covered peaks, mountain peaks, including Europe's highest peak. You may think it would be in the Alps, but it's not. Europe's highest peak is Mount Elbrus on the western side of the Great Caucasian Mountains. Therefore, his description, he derived the description Caucasian from a Scythian term. Scythian was a general term for the region that actually were more north of the mountains and north of the Black Sea. So the Romans just called anybody there, Scythian. So it was a Scythian term, Kroi Cassis. Kroi Cassis. That means ice shining, referring to the peaks, or ice shining, we would say snow white. So the peaks are snow white. So the association of that term, Croicassis, Caucasus, with white skin was just accidental, because the inhabitants of that region typically had lighter colored skin than those who lived to the south of that region, and had lighter colored skin than Pliny had as a Roman. There's also a biblical account. We meet with this in the book of Genesis, chapter 10, verse 3. We meet a person named Togarma. Togarma was the grandson of Japheth. Japheth was one of the sons of Noah. Togarma's seventh son was named Caucasus, or Caucasus. So hence, that's the biblical derivation of the term for the mountain range, because he's considered the father of the patriarch of the people who live in that region between the Black Sea and Caspian Sea. Another note, for those with etymological interest, this word Caucasus, as in Caucasian, Caucasia, has absolutely nothing to do with the word caucus as used in election years. They're spelled differently. So caucus, in terms of the mountains, is spelled C-A-U-C-A-S. Whereas the political term, caucus, is spelled C-A-U-C-U-S. So the political caucus is a term applied to an extraordinarily labyrinthine and complex mechanism used by political parties in some states to make decisions and select their candidates. The word comes from a completely different term for a drinking cup, because that's how they voted. Now, not now. Now that they do. Actually, I don't know what they do now. But then originally, they would get a big cup, and when they had to vote, they would have either colored marbles for yes or no, or ballots, and they just stick them pass it around and stick it in the cup. Then they dump it out and separate in front of everyone. And that's how they would vote. Anyway, control of the passes through the Caucasus Mountains and opportunity for tax theft, conscription, or enslavement of the population of Caucasia triggered a Greco-Persian war between 503 and 506 AD. The significance in terms of this unit introducing Islam is that this was the first of a series of crippling, ruinously destructive wars between the Byzantines and the Persians that weakened both, enabling Islam to later invade and dismember those empires in a single generation. And also, as we go through, we can't go through all the details, but in these conflicts we'll see that the population in Arabia got drawn into some of these conflicts, and to their detriment. And so there was also an element of revenge, to get back at the Greeks and the Persians for having meddled in their territory. This particular conflict ended in 506 indecisively, with both sides having to stop in order to deal with other problems. Persia had a civil war. Byzantium had to deal with the Huns. The peoples of Caucasia, whom of course no one had consulted, used the opportunity to assert their independence into separate kingdoms: Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, etc. The Byzantine Greeks began construction of a major infantry base in the present-day Turkish village of Oguz in the Mardin province. That's eastern Anatolia, eastern Turkey, meaning that they planned to come back. I mean, they weren't going to let this go. 12 years later, in 518, the Byzantine Emperor Anastasius I died childless. He was followed by a Thracian commoner who joined the army, rose through the ranks, became a general. He married the sister of a Byzantine senator, which put him in a position to proclaim himself and be recognized by the Senate as Emperor Justin I. He facilitated an end to the Acacian Schism with Rome. Justin did not openly engage the Persians in battle. Rather, he preferred a different strategy. He preferred to undermine them through proxies. So we left Caucasia with Georgia, Armenia, Lazica, which is in antiquity was Colchis, on the southeast Black Sea, and then further inland. He supported their independence. He basically gave them money in order to make their kingdom stronger and their independence as a way to be multiple thorns in the side, or rather in the neck, of Persia. Azerbaijan remained neutral at this point. The Emperor Justin died on the 1st of August, 527, also without a son. His next male heir was his nephew, who followed him on the Byzantine throne as the Emperor Justinian I, or Justinian the Great. So the Code of Justinian, for those of you who've studied law, that's this guy. Justinian was ethnically mixed. He was Roman and Thracian. We encountered him earlier in the course, pursuing the dream of uniting the empire once again, the Roman Empire once again, by waging war on the Foederati successor kingdoms in the west. He started with North Africa and won, took back the Vandal kingdom of North Africa, the island of Sicily, then he invaded Italy, and that was the Gothic War. And we talked about that during the life of Gregory the Great. To the east, he still had to deal with Persia. The Persian Shah, that's the Shah, the King of Kings. That's their version. Instead of calling him Augustus or Caesar, or King, that's their supreme ruler. The Shah at the time was Kavad I. He was exasperated with the Byzantines funding proxy conflicts through the Christian kingdoms of Caucasia. He retaliated in 528 by attempting to impose Zoroastrian religion on the Christians in Caucasia, Armenia, Georgia, Lazica, etc. And Zoroastrians were pagans. It's fire worshipping. It's pyrolatry. The Christians in those kingdoms, since they had only asserted their independence with assurances of Byzantine help, even though it was Justinian's successor, they appealed to Justinian for help. Now, he was fully engaged in the Gothic War in the West. Nevertheless, he believed that this was an opportunity to neutralize the Persian threat permanently with a swift, decisive war. As combat developed, the war was not swift. It lasted 4 years. But it was decisive. It was a decisive defeat for Justinian. In September of 532, Justinian accepted a humiliating treaty called the Treaty of the Treaty of Perpetual Peace. You got that? The Treaty of Perpetual Peace was actually, now that's not just me making fun of it. That's actually what they called it. The Treaty of Perpetual Peace. I mean, it's, I shouldn't laugh, but the human capacity for self-delusion, it really is infinite. It really is. I mean, it's more infinite than the universe. Anyway, by the terms of this treaty, the Greeks, Justinian, who lost, had to pay the Persians 11,000 pounds of gold bars for an end to hostilities. Significantly, during the course of this war, Justinian attempted to suborn Yemen in Arabia against Persia. So the fighting was really triggered by Caucasia in the north, but remember I said that it's north and south. So the southern region outside of both empires was Arabia, and that was not a single country at the time. It was multiple, entities, tribal kingdoms, one of which was Yemen, which we'll talk about. And so Justinian tried to suborn Yemen to start another front in the war, another proxy conflict against Persia. As a result, Arabs were recruited into the service of both Greek and Persian armies as soldiers, with long-term implications for the history of Islam. That means in Arabia there was a significant portion of the male population who had served in these armies, who knew their tactics, who knew where their bases were. Anyway, we'll remember, nothing just happens. Okay, this brings us south. I mentioned we get to south of the Byzantine-Persian block of territory, the land of Muhammad's birth, Arabia. The Arabian Peninsula is actually it's the largest peninsula in the world that does not have a river. There's not a single river. So this is Arabia, where Muhammad was born. Okay, so you see, it's between the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, and here's the Arabian Sea, the Gulf of Aden, but it's the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean. So Muhammad was born on the Red Sea side. You see Mecca and Medina. He was born in Mecca, and then as we'll see, went to Medina. So the Holy Land is up here, and the Red Sea separates Arabia from Africa. You see Ethiopia here. There's the town Aksum. I'm going to mention that shortly. That was a Christian kingdom. And here was Yemen. Now, it doesn't look like, I mean, we normally associate this region with just bleak deserts, something that has no value. But that's not the case. I mean, now it has oil, but I mean, then they didn't know that. But it was valuable in terms of trade. So, let's see. I need another map here. So consider what I'm going to talk about next. So that same region I showed you, this is Arabia. So right over here is India. So Yemen was strategically placed for trade with India, with that coast of India. And from India and Yemen up to the Red Sea, debark in Egypt, then on the port of Egypt. I mean, so then you can get to the whole empire. Now there's a Suez Canal. They didn't have that then, but there was still, it was still a very important trade route. So keep that in mind. So you see, here's the Caucasia to the north of Persia, Byzantium. Here's Arabia to the south. Currently, Arabia consists of 7 countries: Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. The prefix Saudi to Saudi Arabia refers to the bin Sauds, that's a family, the ruling family of the largest of those political entities, Saudi Arabia, established in 1932. But just Arabia, without any prefix, refers to the entire peninsula, named for the predominant ethnic group, the Arabs. Muhammad, as I said, was born on the Red Sea side of the peninsula. The Red Sea is 1,300 miles long. The Caucasian region to the north of the Byzantine-Persian bloc was of interest to them because of the mountain passes and the ports on the Black Sea and Caspian Sea. Arabia to the south was of interest for access to trade with India. In the Bible, in the Old Testament, King Solomon even engaged with such trade with Yemen, the kingdom of Sheba. It was that in Arab history, it's the Saba, the Sabaean kingdom. But for the Hebrews, they rendered that Sheba. The connections into the Greco-Roman world between India, Yemen, and the Greco-Roman world were firmly established by Alexander the Great's conquest. And his successors, Alexander died in 323 BC. He did have a son. His son was quickly murdered, and then his generals divided up his empire. The general Ptolemy took Egypt. And his successors, all of Ptolemy's successors, the males all call themselves Ptolemy, and the females all call themselves Cleopatra. So they solidified that trade. South through the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean, following the southeast coast of Arabia to the Bay of Bengal and the west coast of India. From the Arabian ports, caravan merchants traded for goods that landed in the ports, which they could portage across the desert on camels all the way to Petra in Jordan and Damascus in Syria. The Romans stole as many of these trade routes as they could from the Egyptian Ptolemies when Augustus conquered Egypt from Antony and Cleopatra, She was Cleopatra VII, if you're interested, in 30 BC. The trade was so regular that some Roman accounts refer to Yemen in southern Arabia as India, because that was their source for Indian spices. 5 years later, 25 BC, the Romans attempted to conquer western and southern Arabia, meaning the east coast of the Red Sea, the Arabian side of the Red Sea, and Yemen, down to Yemen, in order to assert direct control over the trade routes. This expedition was led by the Roman governor of Egypt, Aelius Gallus. A Roman army of 10,000 troops was deliberately misled into the desert by their Arab guides, who certainly didn't want a Roman army settling for life in Arabia, and then just left them there to die of thirst. So it ended. This invasion of Arabia ended in a humiliating defeat, and Arabia was never incorporated into the Roman Empire. Control of the trade routes then became contested locally, because they were lucrative, they were valuable, and wherever there's money, there's going to be war. That's the world, fallen by sin. It was contested locally between different Arab tribes in Yemen, the Himyarites versus the Sabaeans, on the western side of the Red Sea. Also became involved, was the kingdom of Aksum, on the eastern side of the Red Sea, which is present-day Ethiopia, on the western side of the Red Sea, present-day Ethiopia in Africa. Just to add to the complexity here, and also explaining some of the background for Muhammad, the Ethiopians at this point were Christian. They converted to Christianity in 328 AD. While one faction, one portion of the population in Yemen was also Christian. The Sabaeans, the descendants of the Sheba, were Christian, whereas a different faction among the Yemenis were Jews that converted to Judaism. Those were the Himyarites. They converted to Judaism in 380, and they set up a kingdom. So the kingdom of Yemen, the Himyarite kingdom of Yemen, was actually a Jewish kingdom. Meanwhile, on the Persian Gulf side of Arabia, the Banu Lakin, it's just another Arab tribe, were client allies of the Zoroastrian Persians, therefore allied with pagans. Whereas the Banu Ghassan, who were further inland, north-central Arabia, had the same client relationship with the Romans and then with the Byzantines. And many of the Ghassanids converted to Christianity, while the Lakhmids were Zoroastrian Persians. So you have that in the northeastern part of Arabia. Then in the south, you have Arab kingdoms that were Jewish, were Christian, and pagan. The importance of all this, in terms of the development of Islam, the background of Islam, is that by the time of Muhammad's birth in 570 AD, Christianity and Judaism were well known by Arabs. Commerce and travel were routine and of mutual benefit. At the same time, both the Byzantine Greeks and the Persians manipulated these various Arab tribes and kingdoms into fighting proxy wars, fighting against each other, but on behalf of either the Greeks or the Persians, often misusing religion, manipulating religious differences as an excuse to foment these conflicts. This is one of many factors to keep in mind to understand how and why Muhammad was able to unite the Arabs, who were tired of being used by outsiders, and why so many of those Arabs so willingly embraced, after Muhammad's death, simultaneously invading both empires, the empire of the Byzantine Greeks and the Persians or Astrians, which otherwise one would think would be suicidal for semi-nomadic tribal societies. But, remember, they knew what they were dealing with because so many had fought in those armies. So one example to make this kind of real. In the year 521 AD, a Himyarite, Yemeni, Jewish king, all right, so Yemen, southern Arabia, ethnically Arab, but religiously Jewish. So the Jewish Yemenis, it was the Himyarite kingdom, Himyarite. His name was Yusuf Asar. He marched on the port city of Mocha. Yes, the coffee. That's where the name comes from. Mocha was the coffee port of Yemen at the southern entrance to the Red Sea. So he attacked Mocha. Mocha was Sabaean Yemeni. He attacked it because he heard that Yemeni Christians were persecuting Yemeni Jews. He killed 14,000 Christians. He captured another 11,000, the women and children, for sale on the slave markets. At the same time, Yusuf sent another army under a different commander, another Yemeni Jewish commander, 510 miles northeast to Najran. Now that's on the Saudi side of the border with Yemen. There, 20,000 Christians were killed. When news traveled, the Byzantine emperor, who was unable to directly intervene owing to the ongoing war with Persia mentioned earlier, he paid the Ethiopian Christian kingdom of Aksum to form common cause with Arab Christians in southwestern Arabia, with the Sabaeans, to seek vengeance. By 527, this alliance of the Ethiopian Christians with the Yemeni Christians erased the Jewish kingdom, the Himyarite kingdom in Yemen, replacing it with a Christian kingdom. So returning to the Byzantines, there was a change of power at this time between Justin to Justinian I. Justinian faced a new Persian monarch. He was Kavad I's son, and this guy's name was Khosrow. Khosrow I. He was the Shah of Persia from 531 to 579. He followed his father, Kavad I. In the year 540, 8 years after the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, an independence uprising in Armenia, which is in Caucasia, remember that's in the north, provided Shah Khosrow an excuse to bring his army on the rounds of the Christian realms in Caucasia. He demanded payment from them to prove their loyalty. If they resisted, well, okay, they revealed that they're disloyal. And he sacked their cities and took the money anyway. It actually ended up taking much more. He proceeded in this fashion, one after another, all the way to Syria, which, remember, at the time was Christian, and it was part of the Byzantine Empire. Justinian had to respond. This was an invasion. Though Justinian was still heavily engaged, and by this point was actively losing the Gothic War in Italy. This Greco-Persian War lasted 22 years, ending in 562 with the Treaty of Dara. The Persians asserted dominion over the Christian lands of Caucasia, but they agreed to allow free practice of the faith. In return, the Greeks had to pay the Persians an annual tribute of 30,000 gold pieces. This treaty specifically mentioned Arab allies. So once again, Arabs served as mercenaries in both armies. 8 years later, Muhammad was born. On our calendars, it was the 20th day of August in the year 570 that Abu Qasim Muhammad was born in Mecca, on the Red Sea side, on the western side of present Saudi Arabia. With regard to the calendar, Muslims do not begin their calendar with the birth of Muhammad. Instead, they begin it with the Hijra, which the year of flight, which we'll discuss probably in a future session. And that corresponds to the year 622 on our calendars. So the year, for example, the year 2020 AD in the West is the Islamic year 1442 H. But so the dates to follow I'll give in the Western enumeration to align with things we've already covered. Because this is going on while some of the people we've already covered were alive, like Isidore. I mean, that they were alive while this was going on. Following the approach that we've done, try to be fair to everyone. We're taking the people and the time on their own terms. Here is an excerpt from the earliest surviving biography written of Muhammad, his earliest biography. It was written in the 8th century by a devout Muslim named Muhammad bin Ishaq. Bin Ishaq. So the bin just means son of, and Ishaq is Isaac, so he was Muhammad, the son of Isaac. And Ishaq is Ishaq, bin Ishaq. He was alive during the early expansion of Islam, some of which we'll get to in a future session. Like he was alive when Islam conquered Spain. He was alive when they invaded France in 732, the Battle of Tours. He was alive when they first laid siege to Constantinople. So he's certainly a primary source. So this is a quote from his work titled Life of the Messenger of God. Quote, "It is recorded that when the mother of the apostle of Allah became pregnant with him, she had a vision. And a voice spoke to her, saying, 'Thou art pregnant with the prince of this nation. When he is born on this earth, thou must say, I place him under the protection of the only one, from the wickedness of every envious person. And thou must name him Muhammad.'" And I'll interject here that the name Muhammad comes from the Arabic word hamada, which means praise or praiseworthy. Back to the quote, further down. "Abdullah bin Abdul Muttalib, the father of the apostle, died while the child was yet unborn." Further down. "When his mother was delivered of the apostle of Allah, she sent the following message to his grandfather. 'An infant is born to you. Come and see him.' He came, and she informed him of what she had seen and heard during her pregnancy, and the name she had been ordered to give the child. It is said that his grandfather took the boy into the Kaaba and prayed to Allah and thanked him for his gift. Then he brought him again to his mother." Okay, so this is a quote. So again, taking Muhammad in the terms of what Muslims thought of him, especially in the Middle Ages. This is an exact quote of what a Muslim in the Middle Ages believed. So this passage reveals to us 4 details that are essential in understanding how Muslims regard Muhammad, or at least how Muslims in the Middle Ages regarded Muhammad, and how that perception influenced their view of Christianity and Judaism. First detail. His father's name tells us that Muhammad was ethnically Arab. The word Arab first appears on a monument celebrating the Battle of Karkar in the year 853 BC. It took place in northwest Syria. If you want to look it up, it's spelled Q-A-R, Q-A-R. The monument was put up by the victor, of course. The Assyrian king Shalmaneser III vanquished an alliance of Ben-Hadad II of Damascus and Ahab, king of Israel. And Ahab, King Ahab and Jezebel. So we encounter them in the cycle of readings that's in the first book of Kings, chapters 16 through 22. The winner, Shalmaneser, boasted that he captured 1,000 camels from the Arabs. Ahab's involvement with Damascus is recorded in the first book of Kings, chapters 20 through 22. The name of this particular battle is not mentioned in the Bible, but the connection with Ben-Hadad is, and that was very stormy. There were enemies, and there were allies, there were enemies again. And anyway, it allows us to date it. So 853, people were using the term Arab. In Hebrew, the word Araf denotes a desert. The ultimate etymology of the word Arab is a subject of speculation, but one plausible reconstruction is that it means a passerby, in the sense of those living a nomadic paradigm of resource acquisition. The term Arab entered Greco-Roman usage, referring to both the region as well as the people who wandered in it, who lived in it. As for the later Islamic Arabs' understanding of themselves, we have another medieval source. His name was Hisham bin al-Kalbi, K-A-L-B-I. He was an Arab historian and genealogist whose life overlapped with that of Ben Ishaq, whom we already quoted. Ben al-Kalbi collected genealogies and histories of the Arabs. He established what medieval Arab Muslims accepted as a genealogical connection between Abraham, the biblical Abraham, with Muhammad, arguing that all Arabs are descended from Abraham's son Ishmael, his first son Ishmael. So this has been al-Kalbi's line of reasoning. So I'll summarize it because this is what was in the mind of Arabs at the time, when they first heard Muhammad. The Bible tells us that, so the Bible tells us that Abraham's first son was born not from his wife Sarah, but with an Egyptian slave named Hagar, and that son's name was Ishmael. The Arabs consider themselves descended through him, and they call him Ismail in Arabic. That is in Genesis chapter 16. Whereas the Jews also descended from Abraham, but through a different female from his wife Sarah. And that's in Genesis chapter 21. The many descendants of Isaac and Ishmael are listed in Genesis chapters 25 through 35. Both sets of descendants were subject to the pressures of surrounding pagan cultures, and both sets of descendants frequently succumbed to those temptations. But apart from that, the two sets of descendants had very different history. The descendants of Isaac spent 430 years as slaves in Egypt. Later, they pledged the Sinai covenant, Exodus chapter 19 and following. They endured occupation by the Philistines. They fought a war of liberation to drive them out. They established a monarchy in the Holy Land. They survived the Babylonian captivity. They reestablished themselves in the Holy Land until being conquered by Rome. The descendants of Ishmael did not share any of those experiences. However, they did have points of contact. Notably, Moses. When Moses fled Egypt, he took refuge with Jethro in the Sinai desert. Jethro was also descended from Abraham, but he was descended from Midian. Midian was Abraham's son by Keturah. After Sarah died, Abraham took another wife, Keturah, and he had sons with her, and Midian was one of those sons, and that's in Genesis chapter 25, verses 1 and 2. So Moses was a descendant of Abraham through Isaac, Jacob, Levi. While hiding among the Midianites, Moses married Jethro's daughter, Zipporah. They had a son named Gershom. That's in Exodus chapter 2, verses 20 through 22. So there were points of contact. Because they lived in the desert, the descendants of Ishmael referred to themselves as Badawi, those who dwell in the desert, from which comes the English term for them, Bedouin. Over the ensuing 18 centuries, the descendants of Ishmael living in the Arabian Peninsula, which had never been integrated into the Roman Empire, largely relapsed into paganism by the time Muhammad was born. But they never forgot their Abrahamic roots, and that included monotheism, as we'll see. Now, the second item from that quote I get from Ben Ishaq's quote, the second essential item is that the name of Muhammad's father not only tells us that he was Arab, but identifies a specific lineage. That's going to be significant. So we will pick up with that in the next session. For the moment, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.